Okay, welcome everyone. For those of you that don't know, I'm Shannon Schaff. I'm the Executive Director of the CFA Society of Minnesota, and we're very excited today to bring you this webinar on the rise of India. I would be remiss if I didn't mention there we go. We are able to bring you really great programming like this because of all of our annual sponsors that help support the society. If you want to learn more about other events we have, please check out our website. We are starting to add more events as we start to look toward fall. So many things coming up today. But it is also my great pleasure to introduce Kevin T. Carter, who's the founder and chief investment officer at EMQQ Global. And Kevin's going to share his screen and share with you today about the rise of India.
Okay, I think my slides are up. Thank you all. Thanks to the host for organizing, and thanks for tuning in. So as mentioned, I'm Kevin Carter. I'm the founder and chief investment officer of EMQQ Global. I'll just tell you quickly about what that business is, just so you have some framework for some of the things I'll talk about. I'm headquartered in San Francisco. I started my business 11 years ago. We're focused on emerging and frontier markets, and we're focused specifically on the internet sector. And EMQQ is actually the name of our broadest emerging market index that covers all emerging and frontier markets and just the internet and new age tech companies. FMQQ is the same thing without China. And then INQQ is just the India part of the story. So it's one approach, three different sets of geographies. Now, I'm going to talk first about emerging markets at a high level. Some of you may know there's been a renewed interest this year in international investing, investing outside of the U.S. equity markets for a number of reasons. That's become something this year that is very much on people's minds. There has been flows into international investments, mainly into international developed, but also into emerging markets. And so I'll talk about that shift in sentiment also towards the end. But if we go back to the highest level of why invest in emerging markets in the first place, the story has always been very compelling, and it's all true. Emerging markets have most of the world's people. About 85% of the world's people are in emerging and frontier markets. They have younger populations, better demographics. So it's about 90% of the future it lives in emerging markets. They have GDPs that are not only growing faster, they're now considerably larger than the developed world on a purchasing power basis. And the most important thing is that's driving massive consumption. The thing that's actually emerging are all those people. And all of those people want the stuff we have and that we kind of take for granted. They want more food. They want better clothing. They want heaters, air conditioners, and appliances. They want to be entertained. They want to go to movies, take a vacation, get on an airplane for the first time. They want a motorized vehicle, and they want their kids to go to college. And I didn't have to figure this out. It's been very well documented since I got involved with emerging markets 20 years ago. And you can see McKinsey calls it the biggest growth opportunity ever. So maybe they're wrong, and it's the second biggest growth opportunity ever. But if you're going to focus on emerging markets, it's what you should be focused on. It's what I've been focused on for the last 20 years. Now, with all of this great backdrop, all of these people, all of this, this younger population, this growth, you would think people would have made money investing in emerging markets. But in the last decade, basically nobody's made any money. And the problem, in my opinion, is the index itself, the MSCI index, which is what most investors use, but really any traditional broad index covering emerging markets, they have a lot of problems. And the biggest problem is the state-owned enterprises, the government-owned banks and oil companies that have historically dominated the emerging market indexes. These companies count for about a quarter of all of the index. So if you buy the Vanguard or iShares or other broad version of emerging markets, you're putting about 25 cents of every dollar into government-owned banks, oil companies, And these are not really companies that are for investment. They have significant conflicts of interest. They're very inefficient. There's tons of corruption. And when you take all those things together, these companies aren't trying to grow their earnings. And, while I've worked in and around indexing for the last 20 years, I'm an Omaha person first and foremost. And, investing is actually really simple. The reason that companies have value is because they make profits for the owners. And the only way to grow the value is to grow the profits for the owners. And the state-owned enterprises don't care about that. And so the reason people have been underwhelmed by their returns in emerging markets is, I think, largely because of this problem. You can see that the MSCI index hasn't grown its earnings. And so, yes, the emerging markets look cheap on paper, but I think the traditional approach is really the biggest value trap in the world, because if you knew what the agricultural bank of China was, or if you knew the detailed history of Petrobras in the last 15 years, you wouldn't be surprised that there hasn't been any real growth of earnings and thus of value. So nobody has made any money in EM, and I don't think that the traditional indexes will ever really deliver investors the growth they're hoping to get from this growing part of the world. So what I think investors need to do is to do what the Ivy League endowments have done. So when my first half of my emerging market life, I launched a number of China ETFs with Guggenheim that are now owned by Invesco. But I spent most of my time in New York and Boston with a couple of dozen families and foundations and endowments, and I watched what they were doing. You can see Harvard essentially doubled their allocation in that period. But as they got bigger, their allocations got bigger, they would get more targeted. And if you were David Swensen managing the Yale endowment, you had a lot of options. You could, as David Swensen did, take your smartest Chinese alumni or alumni and analyst from the endowment office and fund him to go back and set up a private equity fund in China, which worked incredibly well for Yale and other investors. But most people couldn't do that. And so when people would ask me, what's the best emerging markets ETF? I always told them to just buy the emerging market consumer ETF. It owned and still owns the food and clothing companies, the traditional consumer stocks. Now, I have nothing to do with the emerging market consumer ETF, but when people would ask me, what's the best emerging markets ETF? That was always my answer until 11 years ago, when someone called me and asked me that question, what's the best emerging markets ETF for long term? As I started to tell them to buy the emerging market consumer ETF, I had a light bulb moment. I went back to my office and I launched this company 11 years ago. On November 14th of 2014 was when we launched our first strategy on the New York Stock Exchange. So let me tell you what I didn't see as clearly then as I did or do now, but there's three mega trends that are sweeping the planet, and they're one direction secular trends, and you and I are part of all of these trends. And at least in my family, we've been part of these for generations now. So we don't even think about them as trends at all, but they're big and they're powerful and they are sweeping the planet. So what are these so-called mega trends? Well, the first one we already talked about. When I was a kid, we had plenty of food, we took vacations, we had cars, my brothers and I got to go to college. So we've been part of this consumer trend for a long time, but we've been part of it for so long we don't even think about it as a trend at all. But now everybody else in the world wants the things that we have. So that's the first mega trend. We've already talked about it. Now, when I got that call 11 years ago, I answered it on my iPhone, my first iPhone. So I did have an iPhone 11 years ago, but it was pretty new. However, I had a computer for 20 years before I got this type of computer. Well, most of the world is getting their first computer today, and it's not a desktop computer. It's not an Apple product. It's an Android-based smartphone that gets better and more affordable every year. So the computer is the second mega trend. And the third mega trend comes with it. It's called the internet. I got the internet in 1995 on a telephone line with a PC at my house on a and a Netscape browser that I put on my computer with a disk. So I had the internet for a long time before I got a smartphone. Well, most of the world is not only getting their first computer, they're getting their first internet access, and they're leapfrogging and becoming even more digital than we are. And the result is this. This is the money slide, literally and figuratively. This is showing you the revenue for the emerging markets internet sector. And you can notice in 2014, when I launched, I had the same chart, and I gave my first CFA presentation in 2014 in December for the CFA Society of San Francisco, but my chart went to 2013. But it looked clearly to me that there was going to be a lot of growth, and there has been massive growth in the emerging markets internet sector. Now, importantly, most of this growth has been in China so far. Alibaba, Tencent, the super apps of China in particular have digitized everything. They've digitized healthcare, they've digitized uh, grocery shopping, entertainment. And if you look at the same revenue chart that we just looked at, but this time we look at it with China in gold and all of the other emerging markets in purple, you can see that the last decade, this has been a China story. 80% of this has been China. And China, it may be an emerging market still, and it will be in a traditional sense for a long time. But when it comes to the internet and smartphones, China is the most advanced country in the world by a lot. But the next 20 years are going to be all about the purple area. The Chinese internet companies will still continue to grow. They're also very cheap right now, but they can't grow as fast as they did in the last decade. But the purple, the other 45 emerging and frontier markets, is just getting started. So China has a lot of people, but the other emerging markets have 4 times as many people in that purple. And again, while China is an emerging market, you can see that its e-commerce penetration doesn't just dwarf the other emerging markets, it dwarfs the United States as well. So the third wave of the internet is the ex-China part of the story. So if we think about the internet in waves, the first wave was people like me and perhaps you, depending on your age. But if you're my age, you were right there at the beginning, and the internet showed up, and we had all of a sudden access to personal computers, and we could go on those computers, get on the internet, we could go to a website and buy something. That basically started in the year 2000. Now, and what happened? The FANG stocks took over our lives and our stock market, first on PCs, then on smartphones. And it's still going. There's an AI boost now to this wave. The second wave was China, right behind us. You saw what that looked like. And now the third wave is here. And in many ways, it's just getting started. Now, the first non-China internet company that I encountered was this company, Mercado Libre. When it went public, somebody sent me the prospectus, and I was already very deep in the China internet sector. I had launched with Guggenheim an ETF with the ticker CQQQ. But when Mercado Libre went public, someone sent me the prospectus, and I opened it up to the income statement, and I said, oh my goodness, it's a Chinese internet company in Brazil. So Mercado Libre, in many ways, the first part of this third wave. And let me use Mercado Libre as an example of a couple of other important things with this emerging market internet sector. Almost every one of the companies in this universe, the emerging markets internet universe, almost every one of them has the same story. And it goes like this. The smartest kids from every country go to great colleges like Harvard or Stanford. I'm giving those as just examples. The founders of Mercado Libre went to the University of Pennsylvania, and then they got their MBAs at Stanford. And it was at Stanford in the library that they wrote the business plan in the spring of 1999. The speaker at their graduation happened to be a venture capitalist. The founder of Mercado Libre, Marcus Galperin, asked the dean if he could drive the speaker back to his jet after the commencement, and he got that opportunity. And on the way to the airport, he pitched him on his idea. And he said, Mr. Muse, I'm going back to Buenos Aires next week to start the Amazon.com of Brazil. And Mr. Muse funded the company. And so what I'm trying to say is corporate governance is your biggest problem in emerging markets, but having U.S. institutional investors at the very beginning, it doesn't guarantee better corporate governance, but it's a pretty good head start. And so that's one thing to note about Mercado Libre. The other thing to know is that Mercado Libre is not in the index. If you buy an iShares or Vanguard, anything tied to a traditional broad emerging markets ETF, Mercado Libre has never been included. I'm not in charge of the traditional indexes, but I think it's a problem with the database because a lot of these companies, they don't trade in their home markets, and a lot of times they're incorporated in other places as well. Mercado Libre's headquarters are now in Uruguay. The revenue is from Brazil and Mexico and 20 other countries, but the database shows the company as being in Uruguay. You can see that this is a company that has had massive growth. It continues to grow at about 40%. And it's also the largest company in Latin America by market cap. You can see how it's performed versus Petrobras and versus the broad Brazil index. And so it's pretty clear to me that if you want to invest in emerging markets, these are the kind of companies you want to own, not the legacy corrupt economy and things like Petrobras. And again, even though Mercado Libre is the biggest company in Latin America and the best performing company in Latin America, it's not in the index. If you buy the traditional index, you don't get Mercado Libre. You do get Petrobras, not just once, but twice. Both the common and the preferred are included, but not the great internet colossus of Mercado Libre. Now, elsewhere in Latin America, second biggest internet company, Nubank, online bank with 100 million customers, actually close to 125 million now. And same story. This founder from Bogota, Colombia, went to Stanford, worked at Morgan Stanley as an analyst, went back to Stanford where he interned for Sequoia, was hired by Sequoia after he got his MBA, and was sent down to Latin America to look for deals. And Marcos tried to open a bank account. It took him 3 days, and he said, "This is crazy." Started an online bank with his co-founder, Cristina Junqueira from Sao Paulo, who went to Kellogg and worked for BCG. This company was funded by two of the Mercado Libre founders at Cossack Ventures and also Berkshire Hathaway before the IPO. Again, this is where the growth is in emerging markets. And finally, Southeast Asia, another example, Sea Limited, trading on the New York Stock Exchange. Again, I'm not exaggerating when I say that most of them go to Harvard or Stanford. And again, this company's not in the index. Why isn't it in the index? I don't know, but it might be because the mailbox is in Singapore or because it trades on the NYSE. The headquarters are in Singapore, but the revenue comes from all over Southeast Asia where they dominate e-commerce. So another example. Now, let me now move to India, which is the focus today. India is very special, in my opinion, as I will share with you. And in many ways, India has just arrived. Now, for me and my business, we've been waiting for India for a long time. When I launched my company 11 years ago, we had a lot of Chinese internet stocks that were publicly traded, but there was only one Indian internet company. So on day one, we were 70% China and 0.5% in India. But I had this placeholder slide, and I would say, well, India's going to get here eventually, and it's a democracy, and the man running the place, Prime Minister Modi's done a whole lot to help modernize the country, and he's used a lot of technology as well to modernize the country. And it wasn't until the year 2020 that we finally had Indian IPOs. You can see that it even 4.5 years ago, we still had 1% exposure to India, but right during the COVID, there was 24 IPOs, all of them in India, domestic markets, domestic investors, and so they didn't get a lot of coverage in the United States. They weren't ringing the bell at the NYSE and going downstairs to appear on CNBC, but there was 25 IPOs, and there was also a bubble, a significant India internet bubble that burst in November of 2021, and the entire sector had a 75% correction or crash. But finally we had enough India exposure that it became meaningful. It's now the second largest part of EMQQ. It's the largest part of the ex-China approach, and we also have an India-only strategy that's just the Indian internet sector. Now, let me tell you why it is my strong opinion that India is perfect, at least on paper. If we go back to the checklist of why are we investing in emerging markets in the first place, well, it's no question at all that India is basically as good as you're going to get. So let's compare this checklist to India. You want a lot of people? Well, India has the largest population in the world today. It passed China about 3 years ago, and it's growing. Today, it set a record as the largest population ever. Tomorrow, it'll set a new record. And every day for decades, India will be the largest population the world's ever had. Meanwhile, China's demographics are not nearly as bad as Japan's. It looks more like a European country on paper, but it stopped growing. And now India is the largest. And if we leave out China, India is bigger than every other emerging market combined. So, I talk to a lot of investors all over the world, but mainly in the US and Europe. And sometimes people will tell me they're interested in emerging markets and they're focused on Vietnam or Mexico. And we have exposure to those places, but there's nothing even close to the scale of what India offers in terms of size. It also has the best demographics. It has an average age of 28 and a half, twice as many people under the age of 30 as the entire US population. So it's not only the biggest ever, it's the youngest ever. It has the fastest growing GDP. I am one of many people that think they can actually grow at over 7% if a few things go right. But right now they're growing still faster than every place else at about 6.5%. And that's driving the same thing we saw in China, a rise of middle class consumers that finally have enough money to buy the things that we take for granted. And if you add all of these things together and project into the future, as the OECD has done, it looks pretty clear that India will be the biggest consumer in emerging markets, passing China. And in 20 years, it may be significantly bigger. So on paper, I don't think you can really debate that India is perfect and as good as you're ever going to get if you're an emerging market investor. Now, then the question is, all right, well, where was India? Why is India arriving now? And the reality is that, India has only been free for, I think, 78 years. Their birthday was on last Friday. So they just turned 78. And when they got free from the British, they inherited a whole lot of socialism and a whole lot of bureaucracy. And they made a lot of reforms along the way, especially in the early 90s when they basically almost went bankrupt and were forced to make some reforms. But under Prime Minister Modi, they've made great strides. And he is now in his 11th year, and he has done everything he can to run the country like a business and simplify the tax code, make it easier to start companies, cutting back on bureaucracy. And importantly, he doubled the entire infrastructure. When I got involved in emerging markets 20 years ago, China and India had basically the same GDP. China was a little bit ahead, but every year it got further and further ahead because they were building the world's greatest infrastructure, which was easy in a one-party system. India, meanwhile, with all of its bureaucracy, couldn't even get the power to work. And again, under Modi, this has changed. Almost every measure of infrastructure doubled in the last 11 years, and they're nowhere close to being finished. They have a $1.2 trillion master plan that is comprehensive, that includes their own high-speed trains that they're manufacturing in Chennai. They have electrified the tracks. They're connecting the big cities with ultra-fast trains. These tracks will carry Japanese super-fast trains from Mumbai to Ahmedabad and back. The number of airports will triple. One of the first luxuries of an emerging market consumer is to buy their first airplane ticket for $19 to fly across the country and see their friends or relatives. Today, only 3% of Indians fly regularly. That's going to explode. They'll need to triple the number of airports, which they're working on. And finally, there's a lot of noise in the world, as you all know, with tariffs and trade. But before uh, Trump's second administration, there was already a pretty pronounced trend to diversify supply chains outside of China, China plus one, whatever you want to call it. That, I believe, is going to continue. And India is going to need to continue to invest in port capacity as they're doing to try to catch up with China in that regard. So, on paper, India is perfect. I think the reason it's finally arrived is because of Modi and a lot of his advances. But then India's got two other things that really set it on a whole nother level, and they're very important. And I think the first one is the actual human capital. The tech ecosystem in India is older than I am. Tata Computer Systems, as it was originally called, was launched in 1968. Infosys, the original startup, as they call it, launched in 1981. So you have this tech ecosystem that's 50 years old. You have publicly traded companies, self-made billionaire founders. They've employed millions of Indians in technology and management roles. So you're not going to find that in Vietnam or Mexico or France for that matter. This is something that India has that you're not really going to find anywhere else. You also have world-class institutions of learning and the IITs, the 23 Indian Institutes of Technology, modeled after MIT, that have produced incredible talent. There's another 21 business schools, the IIMs, and you don't have to look very far to see the product of these institutions. There are at least a dozen S&P 500 CEOs who came from India, and that includes the CEOs of both Google and Microsoft who came over on temporary work visas. So again, you're not going to find this in other emerging markets, and you're really not going to find it in any developed markets other than perhaps the United States. So human capital, and what is very important in this India story right now and going forward is that while historically the best and brightest from India, they did want to come to Silicon Valley and work for Google or Microsoft, and they didn't want to be entrepreneurial at home. Well, that is gone. The explosion in entrepreneurism in India is hard to fathom. You've had the number of startups went from 500, less than 500 8 years ago, to 150,000. And the entire country has embraced entrepreneurship. And while most of our founders in the publicly traded Indian stocks today, they all went to IIT or IIM Ahmedabad. But now the entrepreneurs are coming from second and third tier cities, second and third tier schools, and the culture has embraced entrepreneurship. The Shark Tank India is now finishing its fourth season as an example of this. So you have everything you want on paper. You also have people that are becoming increasingly risk-taking and entrepreneurial, and the Silicon Valleys of India are probably the most robust places on the planet right now for a startup culture. Now, the final piece that India has that I think is incredibly important is the part that nobody knows about. Now, people in India know about it, but I talk to thousands of investors in the United States and other countries, and I am quite confident that 99% of investors have no idea about the India stack. Now, let me tell you about the India stack. It takes about 90 seconds of getting over the yawning part of this. But the India stack is what India calls its homemade digital public infrastructure. Okay, that sounds really boring too. What is digital public infrastructure? Well, let's break it down. These are digital things, so they're technology based. They're public, meaning they're free. Anyone can use them. And you can't see these things like a pipeline or a train track, but they're part of the mobile and digital age we live in today. The best example of digital public infrastructure is called the internet. I didn't make the internet. You didn't make the internet. Google didn't make the internet either, but all of us use the internet every day. GPS, another example. I didn't launch a satellite. Uber didn't launch a satellite, but somehow today, if I need a ride, I can push a button on my pocket-sized supercomputer and a car will show up and it knows where I'm going and if I want the air conditioning on. So we use digital public infrastructure. We just don't think about it as being digital public infrastructure. India has the internet. India has GPS, but India also has some of their own stuff that they made by themselves. And it is absolutely genius. It is incredibly powerful. And frankly, I didn't understand this until 2019. I kept hearing about it, but it sounded kind of boring. But now I get it, and it's hugely important. And let me explain to you what this is and what it does. So the reason it's called the stack is because if you make a picture of it, like mine, it looks like a stack of pancakes. These are each different layers of the stack, and I'm going to focus on the bottom two layers, which are the most important. And I think in 5 or 6 minutes, you'll have an eye-opening moment, perhaps, when you see what India has done to transform its country. So let's start at the bottom. The foundation of the stack is called Aadhaar. That is the Hindi word for foundation. So the foundation is called foundation. Launched in 2010, it is an identification program, an identification layer. Now, if we go back to 2009, when they launched this plan, India was very much a free-for-all. Nobody had any form of identification. Only about 17% of the population had any government-issued ID of any form. Only 40% of the people even had a birth certificate. 60% of the people were not even reported. 60% of the people that were born were not even reported. And so they didn't even have a birth certificate. And a lot of people don't know their birthday because they didn't keep track of those things. So they knew they needed to fix this. And in 2010, they launched this Aadhaar program to give everybody in the country a physical ID card. Now, the hero of the story is this man, Nandan Nilekani. He is one of the co-founders of Infosys. He's a multi-billionaire. He's also currently the chairman of the board of Infosys, the largest tech company in India. And the government asked him to be in charge of this Aadhaar program to give everybody an ID card. He agreed to be in charge, but he said, well, if I'm in charge, we're going to use a lot of technology. And when people show up to register to get their ID card, we're going to scan their fingers and their eyes so that not only will they have a physical ID, but they can be instantly verified just with biometric information. Now, all of this was voluntary. They didn't force anybody to sign up. And I knew about this program. I added the logo to my coming soon slide, but we just didn't have any exposure to India, and I didn't pay much attention to this until 2019, when I saw that not only had they launched this program, but they had everybody now in the database. So you can see they passed 1 billion people in 2016 in this database. And so essentially the entire country has gone from informal to formalized. Now, let me start showing you the power of how they've used this stack. So I knew about the stack, but I don't remember the last paragraph on this. In 2014, they set up a program with the banks. And they said, if you're in the database and you have registered and got your card, you can walk into a bank and instantly open a digital bank account with no paperwork. 800 million people, 800 million households in the last decade have joined the formal economy in a digital first way. 830 million digital bank accounts opened in India in the last 10 years. So you've used this stack to bring everybody into the financial system. These were everybody's entire financial life was paper currency 10 years ago. Now they're all digitally banked. Now, let me tell you or show you one of the other key things they've done with this. And again, what I'm going to share is that 2016 was the big bang for India's digitization. And many people would say it was the September launch of Reliance Jio. Now, Reliance Industries, a third generation family owned conglomerate run by Mukesh Ambani, they made a huge, bold bet in 2016. They spent $25 billion to buy the first 4G airwaves and build a brand new physical network covering the entire country, state of the art hardware, ready for 5G and 6G. Now, back in 2016, there was a dozen different mobile phone carriers, service providers, all of them on 2G. None of them investing in 3G because they were all in a constant price war. Mukesh leaps all the way to 4G. Smartphones were getting more affordable and starting to sell. They launch Jio. And back then, if you went into Airtel or Vodafone, it could take 3 days to get a new phone, at least 3 hours. Well, the entire stack has open APIs. Jio took that 3-hour business process and chopped it into 5 minutes simply by letting people get new mobile numbers using their thumbs. And they signed up 1 million people a day for the first 100 days. You now have 500 million people on Jio alone. The entire country is now lit with 5G. And the next slide's pretty important. India has, on the left, the lowest cost data in the world by a lot. 9 cents for a gigabyte. You pay $6 for a gigabyte. If you look at the right side, that's the amount of data going through a smartphone. India's smartphones are using 50% more data than yours today. So you've used this genius stack to not only formalize the economy, but also digitize and put pocket-sized supercomputers in everybody's pocket. Now, the second layer of the stack is a payments layer, the Unified Payments Interface. This launched in 2016, and I didn't understand why they made so much hype. Well, all I saw was the government was creating a QR code-based payment system. Now, based on my experience with Chinese banks and oil companies and state-owned enterprises, I didn't get excited about this. I was really kind of worried about what they were doing. And I also didn't understand why they made so much of a big deal about it, because QR code-based payments was old news. Everything in China had a QR code on it by 2016. Same in Brazil from Mercado Libre's Mercado Pago business. So I thought, okay, well, congratulations, you're going to have smartphones and now you can use them to pay for things. But I didn't pay attention to the details. This is not government owned. It's a government initiated, not for profit. And it's not just Apple Pay, it's instantaneous, free transfer of money from any account to any other account. So I send you 1,000 rupees, it's instantly in your account and out of mine, and it's still 1,000 rupees. And even if we send it back and forth 1 billion times, it's still 1,000 rupees. I didn't really pay attention to that detail. And again, it wasn't until 2019 that I saw what this was starting to do. What this is showing you is that the UPI payments now in India are about 20 billion a month. To put that in perspective, that is half of the entire world's instant payments. Only 1/3 of India is using it so far. The slope of the curve remains 55%. This number will probably quadruple. And to put it in further perspective, last month, the UPI passed Visa. There are more payments processed in India on the UPI every day now than the entire world's Visa transactions. So, and what's happened behind this is the entire Indian economy has gone from paper to digital in the last 8 years. 95.5% paper-based, notes to 86% digital. People are paying their taxes. Tax collections are growing faster than the economy, which is helping pay for the infrastructure. So this stack, and I've only touched on the two, the most important layers, but there's a lot of other layers to this that are adding efficiency, cutting out corruption, and cutting costs. And it's like an operating system for the entire economy. And so, what makes India also very special, when China was at this point in its growth curve, nobody on the planet had a smartphone. The advance of the smartphone in the last 20 years, from we don't even have them to now you can get a brand new pocket-sized supercomputer for $12 in India. This is what makes India so special. And you've got, again, this operating system for the whole country that the world doesn't quite appreciate. And this man is, in my mind, a serious hero, leading all of this. He's invested his own money in some of these parts to get them going. So India has made multiple nonlinear changes in efficiency and cost reduction. And there's a combinational compounding effect that is unprecedented, or as my partner Bert Malkiel would say, there is no antecedent for what is happening in India. Now, let's talk about the Indian internet story. So, the one thing I will stress repeatedly in the ending here is how early it is in India, because I'm a big believer in the miracle of compounding, and you want to be a long-term investor and you want to have as many years of growth as you can have. And if you have big growth numbers at the beginning of that string, then it works really well. This is an 8-year chart, and we're in the first half of this. Excuse me. The black bar shows you India's GDP growing 92% in that 8-year period. The gold bar is showing you the internet economy growing almost 500%. And again, if you look at 2025 and look up, well, it's still pretty early, even though we're about halfway through. So let me give you the best example of the greenfield nature of India. My favorite Indian company, I think, is called Eternal. Now, I'm sure that probably none of you, maybe a couple, have heard of Eternal. You may have heard of the company by its previous name, which was Zomato. The company changed its name 2 months ago to reflect the fact that it has a lot more opportunity than just Zomato. So what is Zomato? This is the DoorDash of India. Food delivery. You want to order food from a restaurant brought to you. 60% of that market is controlled by Zomato. Like all of our companies, the kids, the founders went to the best schools, IIT Delhi. They worked for Bain. Then they started Zomato and got funded by Sequoia. Now, again, that doesn't guarantee better corporate governance, but it's a pretty good head start versus something like the Adani Group. And it is the leader in food delivery. But when DoorDash arrived in the United States, the restaurant industry was very well developed, and the restaurants had plenty of people supplying them and a lot of competition. Well, everything in India is green fields, and every vertical can have 300 or 400% growth, and it will still be early. So consider that today per capita spending on food and groceries is $10 in India versus 230 in China and 550 in the US. So very, very early. Now, why did they change their name? Well, they have two other businesses growing at 100%. One of them is restaurant supplies. Very, very fragmented part of India's economy. Almost all of the Indian economy is fragmented and ripe for modernization. And so not only are they the food delivery leader, they have a business of selling restaurant supplies that is booming. And that itself is an opportunity that's worth tens and tens of billions of dollars. And again, growing at 100%. But that's not why they changed their name. They have another business called Quick Commerce, the brand Blinkit. And this is a company they actually acquired 3 years ago. And this business is absolutely sweeping India, and it is incredibly disruptive. And let me explain what it is and how big it is and how big it might be. Quick commerce is 10-minute delivery of anything. Thousands of items brought to you in 10 minutes. Here's how you need this is how this quick commerce works. First, You want big, dense populations in dense cities. You want low cost labor and two-wheeled vehicles. And there's no country in the world that has those things like India does. You're going to download the Blinkit app, put in your address, and it will populate with thousands of items that they can bring you in 10 minutes. Now, you can see on the screen, hopefully, some of the basics: food, drinks, cleaning supplies, pet care, toothpaste, but thousands of items. And when you push the button on your phone, you're going to get that item in 10 minutes. Now, here's how this works. Rather than have a warehouse like Amazon does every 10 miles, you're going to have a miniature warehouse every half mile or mile, a dark store. And inside of it, there's going to be thousands of items. And when you push the button, whatever you ask for, in 1 minute and 40 seconds, it's going to be in a bag ready to go. And because you're less than a mile away, the person on the scooter is going to get it to you. And again, we're talking about thousands of different items. And now, why is this a big deal? Well, the growth rate of this, it's supposed to grow 650% between now and 2030. But this is an old estimate. Morgan Stanley raised their estimate to 57 billion by 2030. So I haven't updated my slide yet. So, and even if it achieves that growth, it still have a ton of opportunity. Here's why. India has the most fragmented retail market in the world. 13 million mom and pop stores like this, a Kirana store that has 150 items, maybe 200 items. And there's a lot of layers of middlemen between the shop owner and the manufacturer. Now, rather than go down the block, you can have everything they have and thousands of other items brought to you in 10 minutes and not necessarily at a higher cost. So this business is booming, and it's still got a massive opportunity. This 550 billion a year happening in the Kirana store. And even if this incredible growth is achieved, it'll still be early. But it's taking market share from other places because, again, if the Kirana store's got 150 items and the app has thousands of items, they're definitely taking share and creating new markets. Let me give you two examples of things you can do now on Blinkit. Private ambulance service. You get in a bike crash and break your leg and you don't want to wait 5 hours for an ambulance. Blinkit has 10-minute ambulance pickups in certain zip codes or PIN codes. You want to test drive a Suzuki Maruti car. They'll bring one to you in 10 minutes for a test drive. So this is a real disruptive game changer. And the reason they changed the name of the company from Zomato to Eternal is because in the last quarter, they surprisingly already passed Zomato. Blinkit is now the biggest part of the company. So, and the growth rate has accelerated. So now let me wrap this up here by first talking about, traditional Indian internet or traditional Indian indexes. The Indian Broad Index is the MSCI India. It's not as bad as the China version or the Brazil version. It's about 10% state-owned enterprises. There's another issue, though, with India, which is that Infosys and TCS, these might be great companies, but they don't get any revenue from India. So if you're trying to capture the growth of India, it's not clear that these companies are the way to do it. And they're about 20% of the index. And when you combine the state-owned enterprises, the non-Indian revenue sources, you have growth rates that are about the same as India's GDP. And the Indian internet sector will grow several times the GDP growth. Another side benefit, corporate governance. And this is not just an India story. In all of the emerging markets, I think the internet companies have not perfect corporate governance, but certainly a good head start versus some of these companies like Adani Group. And I share Jeff Gundlach's belief that this is a very special thing, and you shouldn't overthink it, and you should, as he says, buy it and put it away for 30 years and don't even look at it. I think Jeff is right. Now, as I started out, there's a lot of people today asking about, non-US investments, and sure all of you have seen the headlines or even had your own thoughts. I know just anecdotally the number of incoming calls we're getting from, old friends that, have lost touch with the non-US markets are calling wanting for a refresher. And, there's a number of reasons that this is happening, but it's, I'm not saying it's going to continue to happen, but certainly people are interested in international and emerging markets for the first time in a long time. And here again, I'm obviously biased, but it seems pretty obvious to me where the growth is. You've got way more people in the emerging markets than the developed ex-US. For example, here's India versus all of the developed ex-US countries, Japan and Germany, the two largest, and you can see they don't even really touch the scale of India. You also have growth. Germany and Japan have almost no growth. Collectively, the ex-US countries have a 1% GDP growth. And again, India itself dwarfs all of these developed countries. So are emerging markets back? I don't know. I don't, make stock market predictions, but certainly they've been relatively out of favor for a long time. And this year to date, which is only a 6 or 7 month period, they've done better than the U.S. But that doesn't constitute a, a, a full rotation. So we'll see what wants to happen. So in summary, as I said, I think India is a very special place for investors. It's the world's largest population. It's also a democracy. It has everything you want on paper. It's got unmatched human capital and a tech sector that is very robust. It also has this cheat code of a operating system, the India Stack. And as I attempted to highlight in Zomato specifically, or Eternal, it's still, I think, very early. The valuations for the emerging market and internet sector are very reasonable. I think on a PEG ratio basis, which is all I care about. PEs are high for India, but so is the earnings growth. And again, I'm obviously biased, but I think if you're going to invest in emerging markets, this is the way to do it. This is where the growth is, better corporate governance. Most of these companies aren't in the traditional indexes, and I think valuations are reasonable. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. I think I went a little bit longer than maybe targeted, but I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions that people may have. And you can either put them in the box, or perhaps Shannon or Megan will, uh, find the questions and ask them if there are any. But I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. And I should also say, if you want to, you can always reach out to me via email or otherwise, and we'll respond. But let's see.
Hey, Kevin, this is Chris Becker. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir. How are you?
Yeah, doing well. Thank you. Great presentation. Can you talk a little bit about some of the risks, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about, you know, the benefits of being a large, the largest democracy, the growth potential of the age, et cetera. Can we talk a little bit about geopolitical risk being positioned between Russia, China, Pakistan, potential flight risk of talent going to those other areas like Europe or other parts of Asia or even the United States or South America, depending on living, those kinds of things. Within you could have a resource drain, and then you didn't talk anything about the natural resources where they might be weak in certain areas. I'm just not as familiar with it, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, even though it's kind of a loaded question.
No, that's fine. And I'm sure I have my risk slide in the appendix, but I'm not going to try to find it right now. But if you get this presentation, you'll find a slide on that in the slides that are not didn't share. But on that slide, the first thing I highlight is key man risk, because Modi has very much been the embodiment of this rise of India, and uh, and so he remains pretty critical to the story. Now he's relatively young, he's in good health, but he is going to reach his retirement age this year. It's kind of a soft retirement age, and he can certainly still stay involved and even take the presidency role. But he, at some point he'll leave the prime minister role. And they've also been, there's a lot of ethnic tensions in India, inside of the country, and also with their neighbors in Pakistan. And those have been, real. There's been flare-ups and violence. There's been prime ministers that have been assassinated. We saw the conflict with Pakistan earlier this year. So that remains a risk. I don't think either Pakistan or India has a lot of to fight about. I mean, they don't like each other, but they don't really do any trade together. But I don't think that's a significant risk. Now, when we talk about the bigger geopolitical situation, China, the United States, tariffs, coming into the tariff situation, it looked like India would actually be a winner. And they were the first to come to Washington, Modi was, and they didn't, when we put out our first tariffs, they didn't retaliate, and they engaged to try to work out a deal. And then in the last 2 weeks, things changed very quickly. And as we've all experienced this year, there's been lots of rapid changes in tariffs and big numbers that become small numbers. And right now, that remains a situation. There's a 50% threatened tariff, and the fingers pointed at India were, saying they've been buying Russian oil, and that's the reason why that we've added this tariff and that they've been funding Russia. And the reality is, the United States government asked India to buy the Russian oil because oil prices would have hit maybe $200 a barrel if India hadn't, started to buy the Russian oil, because that's a supply demand situation. And if a big part of the supply gets taken out, then they would have had seriously higher oil prices. And even many U.S. government officials are on record talking about this and thanking India for buying that Russian oil. So my take is that the president really wants to get this war in Ukraine done. And I think his most recent 50% tariff on India was part of trying to drive that to a near-term conclusion. I do not think that we will have 50% tariffs on India, but there's a lot in flux right now, and China is still in the mix. We tried to play hardball with China, and China basically just said, we're not going to send you the stuff you need, the magnets and rare earth materials, and we had to cave pretty quickly and say, okay, well, maybe we won't do that if you're not going to send us the magnets. So I don't know how it's going to play out. It's obviously a big risk right now, but historically, in recent years, India's been in a very unique position. It's been friends with everybody. It's friends with Russia. It's friends with China. It was friends with the United States, and that also made it a pretty important player. So we'll see what it looks like after the war is resolved and after the tariffs are resolved. But geopolitical risks certainly, are a risk. Climate risk is a big deal in India. That's a lot of both rising sea levels. The southeast of India and into the country of Bangladesh is always, partially flooded. So rising sea levels can be a problem. And then along the Ganges, you've had in the summer times incredible heat and pollution. And we were talking 130 degrees some days. And so global warming is very much a potential risk. So those are, I think, the key risks of the population. They have a lot of young people. They need jobs for those people. They know that. They're trying to, attract manufacturing, making it easier for companies to come in and set up. And then in terms of the brain drain, that's actually one of the things that's becoming a positive for India. The Indians want to stay now, and a lot more than they used to. They used to all want to come to Silicon Valley, but now increasingly they're wanting to go back. And in fact, I had an Indian woman who was getting her MBA at USF, University of San Francisco, and she would hope that I was going to hire her once she got her degree, and she got her degree a couple years ago. And before I had to make her an offer, she got an offer from Mark Zuckerberg's family office. And I thought, okay, well, take that job, and I'll try to find a new young analyst from Berkeley. and I talked to one of our friends who works in the business office, and I asked her about the Haas Business School program, which I think is one of the top 5 in the world. And I said to her, "How many students do you have at Cal in the business program?" She said, "We have 400 full-time students and 250 part-time students." I said, "Well, how many of them do you think are from India?" She said, "A lot of the 400, but all of the 250 are part-time students. They're almost all from India, and they already had." She said, without without even knowing what I did, really, she said all of them have 2 degrees already from India. They have an undergrad in technology and a master's in technology. They're working full-time in Silicon Valley at Google or wherever. And on the nights and weekends, they're getting their MBAs at one of the best business schools, right? At Cal. And then she said, "But you know what's amazing?" She said, "It's unheard of." She goes, "Now they all want to go back to India when they graduate." So my point is, and that's just an anecdotal story, but you saw the numbers for the startups in India. I don't think that brain drain issue, I think it's a lot less of a problem than it's been. And I think now it's even a reverse brain drain is happening. So sorry for that super long response to the risk question, but that's my thoughts on that. Let me see in the chat here.
I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Okay. Okay, well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I hope that you found it of interest and value. And if you do have questions, follow-up questions, or you think of other questions, by all means, you can reach out to me however you prefer, and I'll do my best to answer them. And I think the slides will be available. And again, I thank everyone, and thank you to the host for arranging this. And I will hope to do a presentation in the coming years in person in Minneapolis or wherever you do them next time.